You are staring at a single, flickering beeswax candle, watching the way the flame dances against rough-hewn stone walls that have absorbed 500 years of damp mountain silence. Outside, the Spanish night is thick, heavy, and absolutely still. The wind sweeping across the rugged extremes of Extremadura carries the scent of wild lavender, rosemary, and cold, wet earth. But inside this tiny room in the monastery of Yuste, the air smells only of melting wax, old parchment, and the distinct, vinegar-sharp tang of ink. There are no silk curtains here. There are no golden tapestries depicting victories over the Ottomans or the French. There are no ambassadors whispering in corners, no guards clad in polished steel armor standing at attention, and no courtiers waiting to catch your eye in the hopes of securing a duchy, a title, or a shipment of silver from the New World. There is only the rhythmic, steady ticking of dozens of mechanical clocks lining the walls, their brass gears clicking and whirring in a desperate, futile attempt to synchronize a dozen different versions of time. You look down at your hands. They are swollen, the joints gnarled and twisted by a lifetime of gout, the skin pale as vellum. These are the hands that signed the edicts that divided continents. These are the fingers that held the golden orb of the Holy Roman Empire, a domain so vast that people openly whispered God had stretched the daylight just so the sun would never have to set upon your borders. From the mist-shrouded coastlines of the Netherlands to the sun-baked plains of Castile, from the fractured, blood-soaked principalities of Germany to the uncharted, gold-laden jungles of Peru, everything you looked at belonged to you. You were the secular anchor of the Christian world, the living shield against the East, the ultimate arbiter of human destiny, and yet you walked away from it all. The world outside this monastery is still burning with the fires you helped kindle, but you have chosen to sit in the dark, listening to the ticking of clocks that refuse to agree. It is a strange, intoxicating form of isolation. To the rest of Europe, you are Charles V, the great defender of the faith, the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, the man who stared down Martin Luther, the ruler who broke the power of the Pope and held the King of France captive. But here, stripped of the heavy crimson velvet and the crushing weight of the imperial crown, you are simply Charles, a tired man of 56, wrapped in a plain woolen robe, retreating into the shadows to perform the final, most terrifying experiment of your life, learning how to die before your heart actually stops beating. The silence of Yuste is not empty. It is heavy with the ghosts of a fractured legacy. Think of the sheer psychological vertigo required to make this choice. Throughout human history, men have slaughtered their brothers, poisoned their fathers, and burned down entire civilizations just to catch a fleeting glimpse of the absolute power you held in your grasp for nearly 40 years. Power is an addiction that usually ends only when an assassin's blade or a sudden stroke tears it away. Yet, you willingly took the crown off your own head. You stood before the Grand Assembly in Brussels, your body so broken that you had to lean on the shoulder of the young William of Orange. And you told the world that you were tired. You told them that the burden of the world was too heavy for a mortal man, and then you handed your vast empires to your son and your brother, like a man discarding old cloaks at the end of a long, rain-soaked journey. Why would a man who owned the world choose a grave while his lungs were still drawing breath? The answer doesn't lie in political strategy or military defeat. It lies in the quiet, terrifying realization that comes when you reach the absolute peak of human ambition and find nothing there but cold wind and an empty sky. You realize that while you were busy defending the borders of Christendom, your own soul was being eroded by the constant, grinding friction of statecraft. Every treaty you signed was a lie. Every alliance you made was a temporary truce before the next betrayal. Every piece of gold that entered your treasury was stained with the blood of peasants or indigenous souls across an ocean you would never see. You spent your entire life trying to impose order on a chaotic world, only to discover that the world cannot be tamed. It can only wear you down until you are nothing but dust. In the corner of your dark room sits a large, black wooden box. It is your coffin. You had it constructed to your exact measurements, built from the finest cedar, and brought here to the monastery by a team of silent mules. It does not shock the monks who tend to your needs. They understand the heavy, melancholic philosophy of Memento Mori, the constant, deliberate remembrance of death. But for you, it is not just a philosophical concept. It is a physical sanctuary. Sometimes, when the pain in your limbs subsides and the ticking of the clocks becomes too loud to bear, you have your servants lift you into that box. You lie flat on your back, your hands clasped over your chest, and you look up at the ceiling, practicing the stillness of the earth. You can hear the monks downstairs beginning their midnight chants. Their voices rise through the stone floorboards like a low, resonant hum, a sonic river of Latin that has flowed uninterrupted through these valleys for centuries. De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine. Out of the depths, I have cried to thee, O Lord. The sound is comforting, yet it carries the unmistakable weight of a funeral dirge. And that is exactly what you wanted. Tomorrow, you will do something that no emperor, king, or conqueror has ever dared to do. You will invite the local nobility, the monks, and your few remaining faithful servants to attend your own funeral. You will watch them weep for you. You will listen to the priests commend your soul to God while you are still breathing the incense. You will witness your own historical disappearance. As you sit by the fading candle, the memories begin to bleed through the damp air. You aren't just an old man dying in a monastery. You are a child of the cold, gray palaces of Flanders. A boy who was never meant to inherit a global empire, but was caught in the gears of a dynastic machine that didn't care about his happiness. You remember the exact smell of the sea at Flushing when you were a teenager, preparing to sail to a strange, hostile Spain that didn't speak your language and didn't want your rule. You remember the suffocating heat of the Diet of Worms, where a stubborn monk named Luther looked you in the eye and refused to back down, fracturing the world you were sworn to keep whole. The tragedy of your life, Charles, was that you were a medieval man born into a modern world. You believed in the grand, romantic ideal of a single, unified Christian empire, a modern Charlemagne leading humanity toward a holy peace. But the world you inherited was changing too fast. It was a world of printing presses, shifting economics, religious revolution, and national identities that refused to bow to a universal emperor. You spent 40 years fighting against the tide, using your body as a dam to stop the river of time until your bones simply cracked under the pressure. Now, the candle flame gutters, casting long, monstrous shadows across the mechanical clocks on your wall. Each clock ticks at a slightly different speed, a cruel reminder of how impossible it was to govern empires that spanned across different oceans and different cultures. You spent your life trying to make the world run according to your schedule. And now, in this quiet cell, you are learning to let go of time altogether. The crown is gone. The titles are gone. The armies are gone. All that remains is a man, a box of cedar, and the terrifying, beautiful stillness of the mountain night. You close your eyes, letting the low chanting of the monks wrap around you like a heavy blanket, ready to descend into the deep, dark valley of your own past to understand how the master of the world became a prisoner of his own mortality. You are walking through the endless, drafty stone corridors of the Prinsenhof in Ghent, your small 10-year-old hand swallowed by the heavy, fur-lined glove of your aunt, Margaret of Austria. The air here does not taste of the sun or wild lavender. It tastes of winter frost, the damp salt of the North Sea, and the faint, sweet smell of roasted meats drifting from a banquet hall you're not permitted to enter. The floors are dark, polished oak that groans under the weight of passing centuries, and the windows are small, leaded panes of glass that turn the pale Belgian daylight into a dull, silver mist every few paces you pass a portrait. They are your ancestors, the Valois Dukes of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, John the Fearless, Charles the Bold, men with long, grim faces, high cheekbones, and eyes that seem to track your movement through the gloom. They are dead, yet they feel far more alive in these halls than you do. Their armor hangs on the walls like empty cocoons. Their faded banners droop from the vaulted ceilings, and their achievements are drummed into your ears every single morning before the sun has even cleared the horizon. You are taught that you do not belong to yourself. You belong to them. You are the vessel through which their spilled blood, lost lands, and unfulfilled ambitions must be redeemed. You look down at your boots, listening to the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of your aunt's velvet slippers on the floorboards. Your jaw aches. It has always ached. Even now, as a child, your lower jaw protrudes slightly too far forward, the unmistakable, heavy inheritance of the House of Habsburg. It prevents your teeth from meeting properly. It makes your speech sound thick, hesitant, and slow. The tutors whisper about it when they think you are asleep in your high-backed bed. They say it is the physical mark of a destiny too heavy for a single lineage to bear, the price of a family tree that has grafted itself onto every royal house in Europe, until the blood itself has grown thick and stagnant. To understand the old man sitting in the dark cell at Yuste, you must understand this lonely boy wandering through the freezing mists of Flanders. You were born in the year 1500, precisely at the turn of a century, during a midnight gala when the music was loud enough to drown out your mother's screams. They called you Charles, after your great-grandfather, who died in the mud at the Battle of Nancy, his frozen face half-eaten by wolves. That was your inheritance, a name born of architectural pride, military catastrophe, and a desperate, driving need to conquer the world. Your father, Philip the Handsome, was a creature of pure light and terrifying vanity. He was beautiful, reckless, and adored by the courts of Europe, a man who lived for the joust, the hunt, and the fleeting warmth of random bedrooms. Your mother, Joanna of Castile, was an ocean of dark, tempestuous passion, a woman whose love for your father was so absolute, so suffocating, that it eventually consumed her sanity. You rarely saw them. They were distant stars orbiting a political universe that required their presence in Madrid, in Brussels, in Paris. When you were only 6 years old, your father went to Spain to claim his crown, caught a sudden, violent fever after a game of tennis, and died in a dark room in Burgos. The news arrived in Ghent like a sudden winter storm. You remember the way your Aunt Margaret's hand trembled when she broke the seal on the black wax letter. But the real horror came later, in the long whispered letters from your mother's doctors. They told of how Joanna refused to leave your father's corpse. She traveled across the sun-baked plains of Spain at night, accompanied by a procession of weeping monks, carrying his lead coffin with her. Every few miles, she would order the box opened so she could kiss his cold, decaying feet and check if he had awakened. Your mother was locked away in the fortress prison of Tordesillas, a living ghost buried in a room without windows, while you were left behind in the cold damp of the Netherlands. Think of the profound, silent trauma that infuses a child's mind when he realizes that his father is dust and his mother is mad, locked in a dark tower across the sea, screaming your name at walls that never answer. You grew up with the terrifying knowledge that madness was not a stranger outside your gates. It was an uninvited guest sleeping in your own blood, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. This is why you became a creature of absolute control. You learned to hide behind your silence because your tongue was thick and your Spanish was clumsy. You discovered that if you said nothing, men assumed you were thinking deeply. If you never smiled, they assumed you were calculating your next military campaign. You transformed your physical awkwardness into an imperial mask. Your childhood friend and tutor, William de Croix, Lord of Chièvre, taught you that an emperor must never show his heart to his subjects. He would make you sit for hours in a high chair while he read dry financial ledgers, diplomatic dispatches from Venice, and tax assessments from Brabant, forcing you to listen without moving a muscle, without blinking, until your eyes burned from the dust of the parchment. A ruler, Chièvres would tell you, his voice cold as the stone walls around you, is not a man. He is a ledger book that walks. He is a sword that does not feel the flesh it cuts. If you weep, the French will see your tears and calculate the cost of your armies. If you laugh, your ministers will take it as permission to steal from your treasury. So, you stopped laughing. You found your solace in things that could not betray you, things that operated with absolute predictable logic. You spent hours in the workshop of the palace clockmakers, watching them file the delicate teeth of brass gears, balancing the tiny weights that allowed a machine to measure the invisible passage of time. A clock did not lie. A clock did not contract a fever and die in a foreign land. A clock did not go mad with grief. If a clock stopped working, you could take it apart, clean the oil from its springs, and force it back into obedience. You wished, with a quiet, childlike desperation, that the vast territories falling into your lap could be managed with the same elegant precision. But the world was not a clock. It was a boiling cauldron of human ambition, hatred, and sudden violent change. When you were 15, they dragged you into the grand hall of the Palace of Coudenberg in Brussels and told you that you were now of age. They placed a heavy velvet cloak over your narrow shoulders and declared you the ruler of the Netherlands. You looked out at the sea of faces, the grand dukes, the wealthy merchants of Antwerp, the bishops in their crimson robes, and you felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. They did not see Charles, the boy who liked to hunt with a crossbow in the woods of Mechlin. They saw a political asset, a piece on a European chessboard that was about to be moved across the Pyrenees. The real test came a year later, in 1516, when your maternal grandfather, Ferdinand of Aragon, died. In an instant, the crown of Spain, A crown you had never seen, belonging to a land you had never visited, was dropped onto your head. You were no longer just a Duke of Burgundy. You were the King of Castile and Aragon, the master of a vast, golden peninsula that viewed you not as a savior, but as a foreign usurper. You remember the voyage to Spain as if it happened yesterday. It was late autumn, 1517. The sea was an angry, gray monster that tossed your fleet of 40 ships like twigs in a mill race. For days, you lay in your cabin, retching into a copper basin, listening to the wood groan and the sailors pray to St. Elmo. When your ship finally ran aground on the rocky coast of Asturias, at a tiny fishing village called Tazones, there were no trumpets, no red carpets, no cheering crowds. Instead, the local peasants took one look at your fleet, assumed you were French pirates, come to burn their villages and steal their cattle, and formed a ragged militia on the cliffs. They were armed with rusty pikes, old hunting bows, and heavy stones. Your guards had to advance with their hands held high, shouting in broken Spanish that the pale, skinny youth vomiting on the beach was actually their new king. What a miserable entry into your kingdom. You traveled inland through valleys that felt like the surface of the moon, sharp, jagged limestone mountains, dust that choked your throat, and a sun so brutal it turned your fair northern skin red and blistered. The Spanish lords who came to meet you did not hide their contempt. They looked at your Burgundian advisors, who swarmed around you like locusts, speaking French and counting how much Spanish gold they could send back to their estates in Flanders. They looked at your protruding jaw and your silent, hesitant demeanor, and they openly wondered if the grandson of the great Isabella was a simpleton. At your first parliament in Valladolid, the Speaker of the Cortes, a proud Castilian named Juan de Zumel, stood before your throne, looked directly into your eyes, and delivered a speech that was less a welcome and more an ultimatum. "Your Majesty must understand," Zumel said, his voice echoing off the stone walls like a slap, "that the king is but a paid servant of the nation. You are not our master. The law is our master. You must learn our language. You must dismiss your foreign advisors. If you do not respect our rights, we will not respect your title. You sat on your high throne, your fingers gripping the golden armrests so tightly that your knuckles turned white. Your advisors whispered in your ear, urging you to punish the man for his insolence. But you remained still. You remembered the lessons of Chièvre. You looked at the sea of dark, proud Spanish eyes staring back at you, and you realized that this country was a wild horse that would throw you off and break your neck the moment you showed fear. You spent the next 2 years learning their language, forces your thick tongue to pronounce the harsh, guttural sounds of Castilian, and studying the complex, ancient laws of their provinces. It was a brutal, exhausting education. You were lonely, surrounded by people who watched your every movement for a sign of weakness, your only comfort being the long solitary rides you took into the dry hills around Toledo, watching the eagles circle the sky and wishing you could return to the cool, green forests of your childhood. But fate had no intention of letting you rest. In 1519, your paternal grandfather, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, died. The imperial crown, the ultimate symbol of secular authority in the Western world, was suddenly vacant. It was not a hereditary title. It could not simply be handed down from father to son. It had to be bought. It had to be negotiated from 7 independent German princes, known as the Prince Electors. men whose loyalties shifted with every wind and whose palms were always itching for gold. The competition was fierce. Your bitter rival, the young charismatic King of France, Francis the Mercenary, wanted the crown for himself. He was wealthy, handsome, and an experienced warrior, and he poured hundreds of thousands of gold crowns into Germany to bribe the electors. He openly boasted that he would buy the empire out from under your nose and leave you as nothing more than a regional king trapped between French borders. You had no choice but to play the same dirty game, but on a scale the world had never seen. You went to the great banking houses of Europe, the Fuggers and the Welsers of Augsburg, and you mortgaged your future. You signed away the silver mines of Peru before they were even discovered. You pledged the tax revenues of Castile for the next 20 years. You borrowed sums so vast that the numbers ceased to have any real meaning. You literally bought your destiny on credit. The Fugger agents traveled through Germany with heavy wagons loaded with silver coins, purchasing the votes of bishops and dukes like merchants buying cattle at a market. It was a cynical, dirty, deeply unholy business that stripped away whatever romantic illusions you had left about the divine nature of kingship. You realized that the Holy Roman Empire was not an office bestowed by God. It was a luxury commodity purchased from greedy men who would sell their souls for a higher percentage of interest. On a hot summer day in 1519, the news reached you in Barcelona. You had won. The electors had chosen you. You were no longer just King of Spain and Duke of Burgundy. You were now the Holy Roman Emperor-elect. You were 19 years old, and on paper, you were the master of Europe. But when you received the official decree, you did not celebrate. You went into your private chapel, knelt on the cold marble floor before a crucifix, and you wept. They were not tears of joy. They were tears of absolute terror. You knew the history of the empire. You knew it was a chaotic, fragmented monster of 300 independent states, a place of constant rebellion, shifting alliances, and deep-rooted hatreds. You knew that by taking that crown, you were volunteering to spend the rest of your life on horseback, fighting wars you didn't want, defending borders that couldn't be held, and trying to preserve a religious unity that was already starting to shatter. You looked up at the bleeding figure on the cross, and you asked a question that would haunt you for the next 40 years. Why me? Why had God chosen a boy with a clumsy tongue and a fragile body to carry the weight of the world? Was it a blessing, or was it a cosmic punishment for the pride of your ancestors? The answer did not come from the crucifix. It came from the real world, in the form of a sudden, violent rebellion that erupted across Spain the moment your back was turned. The Castilian towns, furious that their money was being used to buy a German empire and tired of your foreign advisors, rose up in arms. They formed the Comunidades, a revolutionary league that seized cities, executed your officials, and marched toward the fortress of Tordesillas, where your mad mother was locked away. They wanted to remove you from the throne and replace you with her, using her fragile, broken mind as a shield for their own independence. This was your true baptism in fire. You were in Germany, preparing for your imperial coronation, when you received word that your kingdom was tearing itself apart. You had to make a choice that defined the rest of your life. Would you act like a frightened boy, or would you become the iron hammer of the House of Habsburg? You sent secret, desperate orders to your loyalist commanders in Spain, giving them permission to use whatever brutality was necessary to crush the rebellion. You watched from afar as your generals burned the city of Medina del Campo, turning its wealthy warehouses into ash and leaving thousands of families homeless. You watched as the fields of Castile were soaked in the blood of your own subjects at the Battle of Villalar. The rebel leaders, proud men like Juan de Padilla and Juan Bravo, were dragged to the scaffold and decapitated in the public square while the crowds watched in horrified silence. When you finally returned to Spain in 1522, you did not offer an olive branch. You arrived with an army of German mercenaries at your back. You rode into Toledo clad in black armor, your face expressionless, your jaw set like granite. You issued a grand pardon, but only after you had executed over 100 more rebel leaders, their heads placed in iron cages along the city walls as a permanent reminder of what happens when you challenge the authority of the crown. The Spanish learned their lesson. They never rebelled against you again. They looked at you, and they no longer saw a clumsy Belgian boy. They saw a king who would burn his own cities to maintain order. They began to respect you, then to fear you, and finally to love you with a fierce, fanatical loyalty that made Spain the solid, iron heart of your global empire. But as you sat in your palace in Madrid, celebrating your victory, a realization settled into your bones. A realization that would eventually lead you to the monastery at Yuste. 35 years later, you had won the war, you had secured your crown, and you had crushed your enemies. But every time you looked at the empty spaces on the walls, where the heads of the rebels had hung, you felt a cold draft in your soul. You had traded your youth for a mask of iron. You had learned to look at dead men without blinking. You had discovered that the only way to rule the world was to let a part of your own humanity die. You looked at your hands, the hands that had signed the death warrants of your own subjects, and you realized that the gears of the imperial machine had begun to turn, and they would not stop until they had ground your soul into dust. You turn away from the flickering candle in your cell at Yuste, the midnight air growing colder as the clocks continue their disjointed dance. The boy from Ghent is dead. The Iron King of Toledo is gone. There is only this old man, listening to the echoes of a childhood spent in the shadow of giants, waiting for the dark water of sleep to wash away the stains of his own origin. You are sitting astride a massive midnight black Andalusian warhorse, the heavy plates of your etched steel armor groaning softly with every breath the beast draws. The air around you is thick, almost solid, with the suffocating stink of black powder smoke, charred timber, and the copper tang of fresh blood drying on grass. It is April of 1547. On the banks of the Elbe River, near a forgotten German town called Mühlberg, a dense, silver-gray morning mist clings to the water, turning the opposite shore into a ghostly, shifting wall of white. Somewhere out there, hidden in the fog, are the armies of the Schmalkaldic League, the rebellious Protestant princes who have spent years mocking your authority, tearing your empire apart, and throwing down the altars of your childhood faith. Your doctors told you that you could not ride today. They begged you, on their knees in your velvet tent, to remain in your litter. Your right foot is so swollen with gout that you cannot bear the pressure of a standard iron stirrup. They had to fashion a special one out of soft leather to cradle your agonizing joint. Every movement of your leg sends a white-hot spike of agony shooting up your spine, a pain so sharp it makes your vision blur and vomits bile into the back of your throat. But when the trumpet sounded through the mist, you pushed your physician away, ordered your squires to hoist your broken body into the saddle, and clenched your jaw until your teeth cracked. You look across the river. The water is deep, cold, and fast, swollen by spring rains. The enemy has destroyed the bridges, believing they are safe behind this liquid wall, shouting insults at your vanguard through the gray dampness. They think you are old. They think you are defeated by the endless, religious bickering of Germany. They do not know that behind your dull, expressionless eyes, the spirit of your grandfather Maximilian has awakened, and that you are about to play the most reckless card of your entire life. To look at the master of Europe at the absolute apex of his military glory is to see a man who has converted his own physical deterioration into an instrument of absolute will. You were not a natural soldier. You did not possess the towering, muscular frame of your rival, Francis of France, nor the booming, terrifying theatricality of Henry VIII of England. You were small, pale, and plagued by a delicate stomach that revolted at the coarse rations of the camp. Yet, while those kings spent their youth playing at war, in glittering tournaments with blunted lances, you were forced to learn the cold, arithmetic reality of actual slaughter. Your ascent did not begin with a glorious charge. It began in the stifling, sun-choked rooms of Italian palaces and the muddy trenches of Lombardy. For the first 10 years of your reign, the King of France treated you like an unpolished boy who could be bullied out of his inheritance. Francis envied your titles. He coveted your Italian lands. He viewed your empire as an iron ring choking the life out of France, and he was determined to break it. He marched his glittering armies into Italy, turning the fertile plains of the Po Valley into a permanent slaughterhouse, challenging you to a duel of empires that lasted for a generation. You remember the turning point as if it were a scene painted on the inside of your eyelids. February 24th, 1525, your 25th birthday. You were sitting in your cold headquarters while a few miles away, outside the walls of Pavia, your Spanish and German mercenaries were locked in a desperate, chaotic death match with the cream of French chivalry. Your troops were starving, unpaid, and mutinous. If they did not win that day, your financial empire would collapse like a house of cards. You did not witness the victory yourself. You received the news from a mud-splattered courier who burst into your room, fell to his knees, and screamed that the French army had been annihilated. Their heavy cavalry had been torn to pieces by the innovative, disciplined volleys of your Spanish arquebusiers. Common men with matchlock guns dropping dukes and counts from their saddles like crows. And then came the phrase that made your breath catch in your throat. The King of France is our prisoner. Think of the psychological shockwave that rippled through your body. The man who had spent a decade treating you with aristocratic disdain was now locked in a brick tower in Madrid, dependent on your mercy for his next meal. When you went to visit him in his confinement, you expected to feel a surge of triumphant pride. You expected to look down on him and savor the absolute reversal of your fortunes. Instead, when you entered his room and saw Francis sitting by a window, his elegant clothes soiled, his proud head bowed, you felt nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. You realized that he was just a man, clothed in velvet, yes, but fragile, frightened, and caught in the same dynastic trap that was crushing your own ribs. You forced him to sign the Treaty of Madrid, demanding that he give up his claims to Italy, Flanders, and Burgundy before you would release him. He swore an oath on the Holy Sacrament, placing his hand on the Bible, promising by his royal honor that he would keep his word. And what did his honor mean? The moment you let him cross the river back into France, he turned around, looked at your ambassadors, and declared the treaty null and void, claiming it had been signed under duress. He immediately formed a new alliance against you, and this time, to your absolute horror, he invited the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, to bring his Islamic fleets into the Western Mediterranean to burn your Italian coastlines. That was the moment the last remnants of your childhood romanticism died, Charles. You learned that in the high game of European politics, there was no such thing as Christian brotherhood, royal honor, or holy peace. There was only leverage. There was only the calculated application of violence. If you wanted to protect your lands, you could not rely on treaties. You had to turn your empire into an unyielding, militarized machine that never stopped marching. And so, you marched. For 20 years, your life became an endless itinerary of dust, mud, and the smell of wet canvas. You lived out of baggage wagons and small tents, traveling from Madrid to Brussels, from London to Genoa, from Vienna to the shores of North Africa. You became the most traveled ruler in human history, an imperial nomad who spent more time sleeping on a camp cot than in the gilded beds of his palaces. Your subjects rarely saw you in your robes of state. They saw you in your grease-stained riding cloak, your face covered in highway dust, your jaw set against the constant ache of your stomach. You became a master of logistics, an emperor who won his wars not with tactical genius, but with an obsessive attention to the price of wheat, the availability of draft mules, and the interest rates of Italian banks. You realized that an army was not a collection of brave knights. It was a hungry, angry mouth that consumed 10,000 loaves of bread a day and muttered about mutiny the moment the silver coin arrived an hours late. You remember the heat of Tunis in 1535. You had grown tired of the Ottoman corsairs under Barbarossa raiding your Spanish towns, dragging thousands of your Christian subjects into the slave markets of Algiers. You did not send a general. You led the armada yourself. You sailed across the blue Mediterranean with 300 ships. Your white tents lined the burning sand dunes of Africa under a sun that felt like an open furnace. When your ironclad veterans breached the walls of Tunis, you let them loose. For 3 days, the city was turned into an oven of screams, plunder, and smoke. You sat on your horse in the center of the ruins, watching your soldiers carry out sacks of gold and strings of weeping captives. And you felt a grim, dark satisfaction. You had proven to the world that the shield of the Habsburgs could reach across the sea to strike your enemies in their own sanctuaries. You were hailed as the champion of Christendom, a new crusader king, returning with the laurels of victory. But when you returned to Europe, the smoke of Tunis followed you. The victory did not buy you peace. It only raised the stakes of the game. The French king attacked you again in Italy. The Ottoman fleets struck back at Nice. And in Germany, the Protestant cancer was spreading through the vital organs of your empire like rot in an old oak tree. Now, look back at the river at Mühlberg. The mist is finally starting to lift, shredded by the morning sun, revealing the black water rushing past. Your scouts have found a young German peasant who claims to know a hidden ford where the horses can cross, a place where the water rises only to the saddle girths. Your generals are horrified. They tell you it is a trap. They say the enemy has hidden artillery on the heights. They remind you that if your warhorse slips in the current, your heavy armor will drag you down to the bottom of the Elbe like an anvil. You do not listen to them. You look at the Duke of Alba, your iron-willed commander, and you give the order with a single, sharp nod of your head. Forward. You urge your horse into the icy water. The current hits the animal's chest with a muddy roar, throwing white spray over your polished breastplate. The cold water socks through your leather stirrups, turning the pain in your foot into a numb, throbbing ache. Around you, thousands of Spanish cavalrymen plunge into the river, their swords drawn, shouting their ancient battle cry, Santiago, Castle in San Diego. The crossing is a magnificent, terrifying madness. The enemy on the far bank is caught completely off guard. They never believed a European emperor, crippled by disease and weighed down by steel, would swim a major river in the teeth of their defenses. They fire a few scattered, panicked volleys that hiss harmlessly into the water, and then they turn and run. Your cavalry swarms up the muddy banks, cutting through their rear guard like a scythe through ripe wheat. By the time the sun reaches its zenith, the battle has turned into a total rout. The leader of the Protestant rebellion, the massive, battle-hardened elector, John Frederick of Saxony, is trapped in a small wood, surrounded by your Spanish pikemen. They drag him from his horse, bleeding from a deep sword slash across his left cheek, his expensive armor covered in German mud. They bring him to you. You are still sitting on your black horse at the edge of the battlefield, your armor wet, your breathing heavy and ragged. John Frederick looks up at you, wiping the blood from his chin, trying to maintain his aristocratic dignity despite his humiliation. Most potent and gracious emperor, the elector says in German, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and pride. I am your prisoner. I hope that your majesty will treat me as a prince of the empire, according to the laws of our land. You look down at him from your saddle. Your face does not move. Your jaw is frozen like stone. You do not offer him a warm hand or a word of chivalrous comfort. You remember the 20 years of insults, the letters he signed calling you a foreign tyrant, the churches he stripped of their golden ornaments, and the empire he tried to tear out of your hands. I am your emperor now, you reply in your thick, slow Castilian Spanish, your voice dropping into the quiet clearing like a lead weight. You shall be treated as you deserve. It was the greatest moment of your life. You had broken the spine of the Protestant resistance. You had captured their greatest champion. You had restored the ancient authority of the imperial crown through sheer, unadulterated force of will. In the days that followed, you forced the rebel cities to open their gates to your garrisons. You took their artillery pieces and melted them down to cast statues of your victories. You felt, for a brief, intoxicating moment, that you had finally achieved the grand dream of your youth, a single, unified Christian world, bowing to your command. But as you sat in your victory tent in the weeks after Mühlberg, watching your accountants list the captured banners and the gold fines levied on the German towns, the shadow began to fall across your face again. The victory had a taste, and that taste was not sweet. It was the taste of dry ash. You had conquered the princes, but you had not conquered their ideas. You noticed that when you rode through the streets of Wittenberg or Torgau, the people did not cheer. They stood in the doorways and the windows in absolute silence, their eyes burning with a deep, silent hatred that no army could execute. They looked at your Spanish soldiers as foreign occupiers, and they looked at you as an aging, Catholic oppressor trying to chain their souls to an ancient system that they had outgrown. You realized that the victory at Mühlberg was an illusion. You had held back the river of history for an afternoon by swimming across it, but the water was still rising. The pressure was still building against your dam, and your own limbs were growing too weak to hold the stones in place. You looked at the captive elector, sitting in his guarded tent, and you realized that by keeping him a prisoner, you had not destroyed his cause. You had only turned him into a martyr. The candle in your cell at Yuste has burned down almost to the wood now, its wick drowning in a small pool of translucent wax. The whirring of the mechanical clocks seems to grow faster, a chorus of brass voices mocking the great victory on the Elbe. You look at your gnarled fingers, the finger that held the leash of the Duke of Alba and the destiny of Germany, and you realize that every step of your ascent was just a higher platform from which you would eventually have to fall. You lean your head against the back of your high chair, closing your eyes to the memory of the river, letting the cold air of the Spanish night wash over the phantom pains of an emperor who once thought he could conquer time itself. You are sitting alone in the middle of a cavernous, marble-floored reception room within the imperial palace at Augsburg. The year is 1550, and the high summer heat of Germany is trapped beneath the vaulted ceilings like stagnant water in a forgotten cistern. Outside the tall arched windows, the distant hum of the city sounds like a swarm of angry bees. The rattling of heavy, iron-rimmed merchant wagons, the sharp bark of foreign mercenaries drilling in the squares, and the dry, rhythmic thud of stonemasons shaping new fortifications. But inside this room, the silence is so absolute that you can hear the dry, raspy scratch of your own eyelashes every time you blink against the harsh glare of the sun. Before you, arranged across a long table of dark walnut wood, lies a mountain of documents that looks less like statecraft and more like a geography lesson written by a madman. There are tax assessments from the wealthy weaving houses of Flanders. Wrapped in coarse blue string, there are reports on the fluctuating value of silver bullion arriving at the docks of Seville, stamped with the red wax seal of the Casa de Contratación. There are letters from your viceroy in Mexico City detailing the execution of an indigenous rebellion, and there are frantic, ink-smeared dispatches from your ambassadors in Venice, warning that the Ottoman fleets are gathering off the coast of Cyprus. Every single one of these papers requires your sign manual. Every document represents a crisis, a budget deficit, a border dispute, or a human life hanging in the balance. You lift a heavy goose-quill pen, your swollen fingers screaming in protest as they tighten around the shaft. Your right arm is wrapped in hot flannel bandages, so stiff that you must move your entire shoulder just to scratch your name across the vellum. Carolus. A single word written in a shaky, irregular script that looks like the track of a dying insect across white sand. You look at that signature and you realize that you have become the most isolated human being on the surface of the earth. You are the apex of a pyramid that spans 3 continents, but the higher you climbed, the narrower the stones became, until now you are balanced on a single razor-sharp point, with nothing around you but empty sky and an absolute, freezing loneliness. Think of the psychological distortion that occurs when your daily routine consists entirely of managing the destinies of people you will never see, in languages you barely understand, across oceans you're terrified to cross. For nearly 40 years, you have been surrounded by people, yet you have not had a single friend. Everyone who approaches your chair wants something from you. Your ministers do not see a man. They see an endless source of titles, land grants, and pensions. Your generals view you as a treasury with a crown on top, a mechanism that must constantly spit out silver coins to keep their regiments from deserting to the French or the Turks. Even your own family has been transformed into an array of political tools. You look at the portrait of your sister Mary, Queen of Hungary, hanging on the far wall. Her face is pale, her eyes hollowed out by decades of stress. You forced her to spend her youth governing the turbulent Netherlands, turning her into an administrative beast of burden until her health collapsed. You used your daughters as dynastic currency, trading them to foreign princes to secure temporary alliances that evaporated before the ink on their marriage contracts was dry. You viewed your son, Philip, not with the warm pride of a father, but with the cold, critical eye of an artisan inspecting his successor, constantly lecturing him in long, exhausting letters about how he must never trust his ministers, never show his true feelings, and never, under any circumstances, allow himself to be loved by his subjects. In this world, you wrote to him when he was just a teenager, your words cold as ice on the page. You must expect to live alone. If men love you, it is because they think you are weak and can be manipulated. It is far safer to be feared, for fear is a currency that never loses its value, no matter how much the market fluctuates. You taught him the geometry of suspicion, because that was the only language you had left. You had learned that the moment an emperor drops his guard, the wolves move in. You remember your bitter rival, Francis of France, dying 3 years ago in his palace at Rambouillet. When the news reached you, you did not feel relief. You felt a strange, melancholic pang of abandonment. He was a liar and a betrayer, yes, but he was the only other person in Europe who understood the true weight of the crown. He was the shadow that had defined your light for 30 years. With him gone, the stage felt empty, and the new players, like his cold, calculating son Henry II, seemed smaller, meaner, and completely devoid of the old code of chivalry that had kept your mutual slaughters from becoming purely barbaric. The true tragedy of your golden age, Charles, was that your power was an illusion born of debt. To the common people who watched your processions through the cities, you were a god walking the earth, surrounded by hundreds of guards in yellow and crimson liveries, your progress marked by the roar of bronze cannons and the pealing of cathedral bells. They did not see the Italian and German bankers who walked behind your horse like invisible jailers, counting every step you took in terms of interest rates and unpaid loans. You were the master of the New World's gold, yet your treasury was always empty. The silver from Potosi and the gold from Peru did not stay in your vaults for more than an hour. It arrived in Seville, already mortgaged to the Fuggers, the Welsers, and the Genoese financiers who had funded your wars. You were caught in a monstrous, self-destructive economic cycle. You had to conquer more territory to secure more loans, which required larger armies, which created more debt, which forced you to launch another campaign. You were not the driver of the imperial machine. You were its chief mechanic, trapped inside the gears, covered in oil and soot, trying desperately to keep the engine from exploding while it raced down a hill toward a cliff. You remember an afternoon during the Diet of Augsburg when Anton Fugger, the wealthiest banker in the world, came to visit you in your private quarters. You owed him sums that could have bought several duchies, and your ministers were struggling to find new taxes to satisfy his demands, to show his loyalty, or perhaps to demonstrate his absolute financial superiority over the Holy Roman Emperor. Fugger took a stack of your overdue promissory notes from his leather briefcase. He walked over to the grand fireplace, where a pile of sweet-smelling cedar logs was burning, and he tossed the papers into the flames. "Your Majesty," the banker said with a smooth, aristocratic bow as the paper turned into black ash, "I do not require your gold today. The honor of serving the defender of the Catholic Church is interest enough for my house. It was meant to be a magnificent gesture of devotion, but to you, it felt like a knife wrapped in silk. You realized that this merchant from Augsburg could destroy your entire empire with a single stroke of his pen. He could cut off your credit, stop the flow of gunpowder to your borders, and leave you naked to your enemies. He had forgiven your debt because he owned you, and he wanted you to know it." You sat in your chair, forcing your face to remain expressionless, thanking him with a cold nod of your head, while inside your chest, your heart twisted with a bitter, burning humiliation that never left you. And then there was the constant, exhausting background noise of the religious schism. You had spent 30 years trying to play the part of the Good Shepherd, attempting to bring the straying German sheep back into the Catholic fold through a combination of theological debates, imperial edicts, and military force. You had called church councils, you had argued with bishops, you had forced Catholic and Protestant theologians to sit in the same rooms for months, trying to find a compromise that would heal the broken fabric of Christendom, but it was like trying to hold water in your hands. The more you squeezed, the faster it leaked through your fingers. The German princes did not want a theological solution. They wanted the church lands, the monasteries, and the independence that the new faith granted them. They used Martin Luther's Bible as a shield to protect their own political ambitions from your central authority. You realized that the grand medieval dream you had inherited, the ideal of universalis monarchia, a single world empire operating under a single cross, was dead. The printing press had weaponized the human mind, turning every town and village into a fortress of independent thought that refused to bow to the authority of Rome or Vienna. You began to look at your own crown with a sense of deep, spiritual dread. Had you failed God? Was the fracturing of the church a punishment for your own hidden sins? You spent hours in your private chapel, kneeling on the hard stones until your gouty knees bled, staring at Titian's great painting, La Gloria, which you had commissioned. The canvas depicted you, your wife Isabella, and your children, stripped of your earthly robes, wrapped in simple white winding sheets, kneeling before the Holy Trinity at the end of time, begging for mercy like common beggars. That was your true inner landscape, not the glory of Pavia, not the triumph of Mühlberg, but the image of a naked soul standing before an angry God, trying to explain why you had let his church be torn apart while you were busy counting silver coins and fighting over Italian border towns. The isolation began to manifest in your physical body like a slow poison. Your stomach, which had always been delicate, turned into a battlefield. You could no longer digest the rich meats and heavy German beers that your courtiers consumed. You lived on a bizarre, monastic diet of cold jellied broths, pickled herrings, and stale bread soaked in milk. Yet you refused to let your doctors limit your consumption of food. You ate voraciously, as if trying to fill the hollow void in your soul with sheer volume of substance, vomiting your meals into copper buckets in the middle of the night, while your servants pretended not to hear the sounds from behind your bed curtains. The gout grew monstrous. It moved from your feet to your ankles, then to your wrists and your fingers, turning your joints into red, angry knots of bone that looked like the roots of an old briar bush. There were weeks when you could not be moved at all. You lay in a darkened room in Brussels, your body covered in wet sheets, soaked in vinegar and lead water, screaming if a servant walked too heavily across the floorboards, the vibration alone being enough to send a wave of agony through your nerves. It was during these long, dark nights of physical torment that the idea of the monastery first began to take root in your mind. It did not come as a sudden, dramatic revelation. It grew slowly, like moss over stone. You would lie awake, listening to the rain beat against the palace windows, and you would think of your wife, Isabella of Portugal. She had died 11 years ago, in 1539, after giving birth to a stillborn child in Toledo. You had loved her with a quiet, desperate intensity that surprised even your closest advisors. She was the only person in the world who had never wanted anything from you except your presence. When she died, you locked yourself in a dark monastery outside the city for 2 weeks, refusing to see your ministers, refusing to eat, sitting alone in a small room with her favorite dress clutched in your gnarled hands. You remember the day they buried her in the royal chapel at Granada. You had ordered the Duke of Gandia, Francis Borgia, to accompany her coffin and to verify her identity before she was placed in the vault. When Borgia raised the lead lid and pulled back the white silk shroud, he saw what the Spanish heat had done to the beautiful empress. Her skin had turned to green mold, her lips had melted away from her teeth, and the stench of decay was so foul it made the priests stumble backward, with their handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. Borgia was so shattered by the sight that he walked out of the chapel, resigned his titles, gave away his vast estates, and joined the Society of Jesus, swearing that he would never again serve a master who could die and rot so completely. That story followed you through every palace in Europe. Never serve a master who can die. You looked at your own reflection in the polished steel of your armor, the gray hair thinning at your temples, the jaw hanging lower and lower as your muscles lost their strength, the eyes watery and dim with chronic fatigue. You were that master. You were the emperor of dust. Every city you conquered, every heretic you burned, every loan you secured was just another stone added to a monument that would eventually crumble into the earth. The pinnacle of your isolation was the discovery that you had nothing left to conquer except your own pride. You had reached the summit of human authority and found that it was not a palace, it was a prison. The walls were made of vellum dispatches. The guards were Italian bankers, and the sentence was a lifetime of hard labor on horseback, with no hope of parole until the undertaker arrived with his spade. You lift your eyes from the walnut table in Augsburg, the afternoon sun finally dropping behind the black pines of the Bavarian hills. The room is sinking into a cool, purple twilight, and the mountain of documents before you has faded into a collection of gray shapes. You drop your goosequill pen into the bronze inkwell, its splash sounding like a stone falling into a deep well. You do not call for the servants to light the candles. You prefer the dark now. It is softer. It does not look at your swollen hands or your crooked jaw. You lean back in your high-backed chair, listening to the ticking of a lone clock in the corner, allowing the heavy, melancholic stillness of the room to wrap around you like an imperial shroud. dreaming of a small monastery in Spain where the world cannot find you and where you can finally step down from the summit of the world to look your own mortality in the eye. You are wrapped in thick layers of Flanders wool and heavy fox fur, yet your teeth are chattering so violently that your jaw aches with a dull, throbbing intensity. It is the winter of 1552. You are not inside a grand palace or surrounded by the defensive stone walls of a loyal fortress. You are fleeing for your life through the treacherous, ice-slicked mountain passes of the Austrian Alps, caught in a blinding, horizontal blizzard that turns the world into a howling void of white. Your broken, gout-ridden body cannot endure the saddle anymore. You are strapped down inside a crude, wicker litter, slung between two stubborn mules that stumble and slip on the frozen precipices. Every jolt of the litter, every sudden drop as a mule loses its footing on the black ice, sends an electric shock of unadulterated agony through your swollen knees and gnarled wrists. Through the small frosted tear in the leather curtains of your litter, you look out at the ragged column of your retreat, a few dozen faithful guards, their cloaks encrusted with ice, their faces blackened by frostbite, drag themselves through the snowdrifts. Behind you, just a few mountain ridges away, is your former protégé, Maurice of Saxony, the young Protestant prince you trusted, the brilliant general you elevated, who has turned his armies against you in a lightning-fast betrayal that has shattered your imperial illusions forever. Only a few weeks ago, you were resting in the city of Innsbruck, believing you were safe, believing that the victory at Mühlberg had permanently broken the back of rebellion. You did not see the new conspiracy forming in the dark. Maurice had secretly allied himself with your old nemesis, the new French King Henry II, who launched a coordinated assault while your treasuries were dry and your veterans were scattered. When the news reached Innsbruck that Maurice's cavalry had breached the Ehrenberg Pass and was marching down the valley to capture you, your court dissolved into pure panic. You had to rise from your sickbed in the dead of night, abandon your heavy baggage, your precious libraries, and your state papers, and flee into the dark, frozen wilderness like a common thief escaping the night watch. Think of the profound, crushing weight of this psychological collapse. For 35 years, you were the hammer of the world. You had stared down kings, popes, and sultans, and now, at 52, you are being hunted through the ice by a youth you treated like a son. The imperial dignity has been stripped from you not by a glorious battlefield defeat, but by a humiliating, muddy route through the back door of your own empire. As the mules groan against the incline, you realize that the fracture is not just in the mountains around you, it is in the very foundations of your life's work. The grand structure you spent your blood and gold to build is splitting open along every seam. For decades, you viewed your vast territories as a sacred trust from God, a unified Christian commonwealth that you were personally responsible for passing down intact to your son, Philip. You believed that if you just worked harder, signed more edicts, borrowed more millions, and rode more miles, you could hold the pieces together through sheer force of personal will. But the river of history does not care about your willpower, Charles. You look at your gnarled hands, tucked deep within the fox fur, and you see the truth that you have avoided for a generation. You are trying to govern a world that has grown too large, too fast, and too complex for a single mind to grasp. It was not just Maurice's betrayal that broke your empire. It was the sheer, terrifying geometry of distance. You remember the agonizing weeks spent waiting for letters to cross the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. You would sit in your study in Brussels, making critical military decisions based on information that was already 3 months old, knowing that by the time your orders reached your governors in Milan, Palermo, or Lima, the entire political landscape had shifted. You were an absolute monarch who was constantly blind, reacting to the ghosts of past events rather than the reality of the present. Your empire was an administrative dinosaur, its nervous system so long and slow that its tail could be severed in Spain before the brain in Germany even felt the pain. The betrayal by Maurice was the final, bitter proof that your political philosophy had failed. You had spent your life believing in the old feudal order, a world where men were bound by personal oaths of loyalty, by dynastic ties, and by a shared religious identity. But Maurice was a creature of the new age. He didn't care about sacred oaths or imperial favors. He cared about raw state utility. He understood that in the modern world, emerging from the smoke of the printing press, power belonged to those who could leverage localized national and religious identities against a distant, universal emperor. The French king, Henry II, played the same cynical game while he was busy burning French Protestants at the stake in Paris. To preserve his domestic Catholic credentials, he was simultaneously funding the Protestant princes in Germany and making secret treaties with the Muslim Ottoman Turks to strike at your borders. It was a politics stripped of all moral or religious pretense, a cold, calculated exercise in balance of power survival. You were the last medieval knight standing on a field dominated by modern bureaucrats and Machiavellian princes who viewed your grand dream of Christian unity as an archaic, inconvenient joke. By the time you finally dragged your broken body out of the mountain passes and found temporary refuge in the fortress of Villach, you were a changed man. The mask of iron you had worn since your youth had begun to crack, revealing the deep, dark well of family melancholy that had consumed your mother. You refused to see your ministers for days. You lay in a dark room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain beat against the stone walls, refusing to eat anything but dry bread and cold water. Your sister, Mary of Hungary, wrote to you from Brussels, her letter filled with frantic questions about how to raise new armies, how to negotiate with the banks, and how to stop the French advance in Flanders. You held her letter over your flickering candle, watching the ink bubble and char, before dropping it into the cold hearth. I cannot do this anymore, Mary, you whispered into the empty room, your thick tongue tripping over the words. The burden is too heavy for a mortal man. Let the world tear itself to pieces if it wishes. I have no more gold to buy its obedience, and I have no more blood to spill for its sins. You realize that the only way to save your lineage from total destruction was to dismantle the very monster you had created. You had to divide the world before it divided you. You began to formulate the grand, agonizing plan for your abdication, a process that would take 3 years of secret negotiations, bitter family arguments, and administrative surgical cuts to execute. You had to look your own son, Philip, in the eye and tell him that he would never inherit the grand, unified empire of your dreams. The German princes made it absolutely clear that they would never accept a Spanish king as their Holy Roman Emperor. They wanted a ruler who stayed in Germany, spoke German, and respected their local privileges. You had to split your soul down the middle. You would hand the ancient imperial crown of Germany and Austria to your brother, Ferdinand, while giving the wealthy Netherlands, the Italian duchies, and the golden global empire of Spain to Philip. Think of the profound humiliation involved in this dynastic partition. It was an open admission to the world, to your ancestors, and to God that you had failed to maintain the unity of the House of Habsburg. You were hacking your own family tree apart with an axe, separating the German branch from the Spanish branch, creating two distinct entities that would eventually look at each other with suspicion and rivalry. The climax of this long, slow suicide of your authority took place on October 25th, 1555, in the Great Hall of the Palace of Coudenberg in Brussels, the exact same room where, 40 years earlier, you had stood as a pale, hopeful teenager to claim your inheritance. The hall was packed to the rafters with the elite of Europe, the grandees of Spain, the knights of the Golden Fleece, the wealthy merchants of Antwerp, and the bishops of the Low Countries. The walls were covered in spectacular tapestries depicting the victories of your ancestors, but the atmosphere inside the room was that of a solemn, high-stakes execution. You entered the hall slowly, your body so crippled by gout and exhaustion that you could not walk without assistance. You wore a plain, unadorned, black velvet robe, stripped of all imperial regalia, your only ornament being the golden collar of the Order of the Golden Fleece hanging around your neck. You had to lean your left hand heavily on a crutch, while your right hand rested on the shoulder of a young, ambitious nobleman from the Rhineland, William of Orange, the very man who, years later, would lead the great Dutch rebellion that would tear the Netherlands away from your son. You sat on your high throne for the last time, looking out at the sea of faces that had watched your entire life unfold. The silence was so deep that you could hear the distant, rhythmic creaking of the ships down in the harbor of Antwerp. You took a small, crumpled piece of paper from your sleeve, notes written in your own irregular, shaky script, and you began to speak to your people in French, your voice low, raspy, and breaking with emotion. "My friends," you said, your words echoing off the vaulted timber ceilings, like a voice from a tomb. "You know that since I was 19 years old, I have dedicated my entire life to the service of my empires. I have crossed the seas 24 times. I have led 9 expeditions into Germany. I have traveled through Spain, Italy, and Flanders more times than I can count. I have never spared my body, and I have never sought my own ease." You paused, your breathing heavy and ragged, your gnarled hand tightening on William of Orange's shoulder, until the young man shifted his weight under the pressure. You looked down at your swollen feet, then back up at the assembly, your eyes wet with tears that you could no longer suppress. "But now, my strength has left me. My infirmities have grown too great for me to carry this burden any longer. I am not stepping down because I fear the dangers of the world. I am stepping down because I love you too much to give you a ruler who is nothing more than a dying ghost. I ask you to forgive me for whatever errors I have committed during my reign. I know I have made many mistakes, but God is my witness that I always desired the peace and welfare of my peoples." The effect of your words was devastating. These were hard, cynical men who spent their lives calculating tax revenues and military budgets. Yet, as they looked at your broken frame and listened to your cracking voice, the hall dissolved into an unprecedented wave of public grief. Proud Spanish grandees wept openly into their silk handkerchiefs. Old German mercenaries who had fought at Pavia and Mühlberg rubbed their rough, scarred hands over their eyes. and the merchants of Brussels fell to their knees on the marble floor, shouting their blessings and their prayers for your soul. You turned to your son, Philip, who was kneeling before your throne, his face pale, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. You placed your gnarled, aching hands on his head, blessing him with the ancient formula of the kings of Castile, and you handed him the golden seals of the Netherlands and Spain. "My son," you whispered, your voice dropping into the quiet hall like a hammer on an anvil, "I give you a world that is fractured, a treasury that is empty, and a legacy that is stained with blood. Do not try to be a hero. Do not try to conquer new worlds. Just try to keep what I have left you from sliding into the abyss." When you finally stepped down from the throne, you did not look back. You walked out of the hall with your head bowed, your crutch clicking rhythmically against the marble floorboards, a sound that sounded exactly like the ticking of the mechanical clocks that were waiting for you in your retirement cell. You had done what no Western emperor had done since Diocletian. You had murdered your own public identity. You had stripped away the titles, the honors, and the crushing responsibilities, reducing yourself to nothing more than a frail, aging Christian man preparing to meet his Maker. The candle in your cell at Yuste has finally gone out, leaving the room plunged into a thick, velvet blackness that is illuminated only by the faint, silver starlight filtering through the small window pane. The mountain air of Extremadura is cold, sharp, and clean, slicing through the heavy wool of your robe. The memory of the alpine blizzard and the weeping crowd in Brussels fades into the background noise of the night, replaced by the steady, indifferent ticking of your mechanical clocks. You have escaped the fractured empire, Charles. The wars are now Philip's wars. The debts are now Ferdinand's debts. The heresies are no longer your responsibility to burn or to convert. You have stepped off the crumbling dam, allowing the river of time to rush past without you. You close your eyes, letting your head drop back against the hard wood of your high chair, savoring the terrifying, beautiful freedom of a man who has lost everything and found, in the quiet dark of his own isolation, the peaceful stillness of his own approaching end. You are sitting in the velvety, absolute blackness of your private bedchamber at Yuste, listening to a sound that has become the rhythmic background track of your entire existence. The slow, synchronized breathing of 30 men sleeping in the dormitory wings below you. They are your remaining household, the few who did not abandon you when the golden faucet of the imperial treasury was turned off in Brussels. They are your Flemish chefs, your Spanish secretaries, your personal clockmaker, Juanelo Turiano, and your private physician, Dr. Matthews. They came to this remote mountain wilderness, not for pensions or glory, but out of a strange, archaic devotion to the ghost of a king. But their presence does not pierce your isolation. In the dark, the human mind becomes a theater where the past does not merely echo, it replays itself with a terrifying sensory clarity. You lean your head against the linen pillow, your skin hot with the first subtle, insidious flush of the malaria that is beginning to brew in your blood, brought by the mosquitoes that swarm over the monastery's damp pleasure ponds. The ticking of the mechanical clocks on your wall has shifted its tone. It no longer sounds like brass gears clicking against steel pins. It sounds like the rhythmic, steady fall of a headsman's axe in a dozen different squares across Europe. You begin to think about the myths they are already writing about you in the capitals you abandoned. Your secretaries bring you diplomatic dispatches from Venice and London every Tuesday, and you watch with a grim, detached amusement as the printers of Europe Transform your retirement into literature. To the Protestant writers in Germany, you are a broken tyrant who has fled into the mountains out of cowardice, a man whose conscience was so burned by the slaughter at Mühlberg that he could no longer look at an altar without seeing the blood of the righteous. To the Catholic courts in Madrid and Rome, you are a living saint, a modern ascetic who has traded the vanities of the earth for the hair shirt of a monk, a king who spends his days digging his own grave with a silver spade and weeping over his rosary beads. What a magnificent, ridiculous fiction they have constructed. They want your story to be simple, Charles. They want you to be either a monster or a saint, because the world is terrified of the gray spaces where real human beings live. They do not understand that you did not come to Yuste to become a monk. You did not take the monastic vows. You are still the Holy Roman Emperor-elect. You still retain your titles on paper. You still receive a portion of the tax revenues from Castile, and you still write long, furious letters to your son Philip, berating him for his diplomatic weakness and demanding that he burn the heretics in Seville with greater efficiency. You did not trade your crown for a grave because you hated power. You traded it because you realized that power is a fluid that changes its properties when the container grows old. In your youth, power was a sword, sharp, light, and responsive to the muscles of your arm. In your middle years, it became a shield, heavy, dented, but capable of protecting your lands from the French and the Turks. But in your 50s, power turned into a mountain of wet sand. The harder you squeezed it, the faster it slipped through your fingers, leaving your hands empty and your arms aching from the useless effort. You turn your face toward the window, watching the way the silver starlight catches the brass pendulums of Juanello's clocks. Juanello Turiano is perhaps the only person in this valley who understands your true mind. He is a genius from Cremona, a man who can build an entire planetary model inside a brass sphere no larger than an orange, a machine that shows the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars across the sky with absolute mathematical perfection. You spend hours every afternoon in his workshop, your gnarled fingers touching the delicate gears, helping him assemble tiny mechanical birds that fly across the room, or miniature soldiers that march across the table in tight, synchronized formations. One evening, after a bottle of heavy Ribera wine had loosened your tongue, you looked at Juanello as he was struggling to make two grandfather clocks strike the hour at the exact same second. One clock struck with a sharp silver ring. The other followed 3 seconds later with a dull, leaden thud. "You see, Juanello," you said, your voice thick and heavy with the Flemish accent you could never entirely shake. "You are a master of your craft, the finest mechanic in Europe. Yet you cannot force two simple machines made of brass and iron to agree on the passage a single minute. And yet, for 40 years, I was foolish enough to believe that I could force 300 different German states, 20 Spanish provinces, and 5 Italian duchies to agree on the nature of God and the administration of the law. What a monumental pride! What a grand cosmic absurdity!" Juanello did not answer you. He simply wiped the grease from his fingers with an oil-stained rag, looked at you with his dark, ancient Italian eyes, and nodded his head. He knew, as you knew, that the imperial project was not a tragedy because it had failed. It was a tragedy because it had been attempted at all. This is the shadow that haunts your echoes, Charles. The myth of your legacy is that you were the last defender of an ancient order, but the reality is that you were the architect of the very modernity that is now destroying your world. You wanted a single Christian empire, but to fund that empire, you had to create a global financial system that turned money into an independent power. You had to make the Fugger bankers so wealthy that they could dictate terms to kings. You had to unleash the Spanish conquistadors upon the New World, opening a floodgate of silver that didn't enrich your kingdoms, but instead created a monstrous, invisible inflation that is now gutting the economy of Castile, turning your peasants into beggars and your nobles into debt addicts. Think of the existential irony. You spent your life fighting for stability, for order, and for tradition. Yet every action you took shattered an old boundary. To defeat the French, you had to adopt the modern arquebus, turning the noble art of chivalry into a mathematical exercise in industrial slaughter. To govern your distant lands, you had to create an elite class of lawyers and state secretaries, turning the personal bond between a lord and his vassals into a cold, paper-shuffling bureaucracy managed by men who have never pulled a sword from a scabbard. You were the bridge across which humanity walked from the Middle Ages into the modern world. And as you look back at that bridge from your cell at Yuste, you see that it is burning behind you, and the smoke is choking the sky. The memories continue to shift in the dark, moving from the political to the deeply, painfully personal. You remember your mother, Joanna, who died just last year, in April of 1555, only a few months before your abdication in Brussels. She had spent 46 years locked in that dark, damp tower at Tordesillas, nearly half a century of silence, dust, and madness. For 46 years, you carried the guilt of her imprisonment like a cold stone in your belly. You knew that her madness was real, that she could not govern, that she lived in a terrifying world of imaginary demons and rotting corpses. But you also knew that her confinement was politically convenient. If she had ever been released, the Spanish rebels would have used her as a battering ram against your throne. You had to sign the orders that kept her doors locked. You had to pay the salaries of the harsh keepers who stripped her of her royal clothes when she refused to bathe. You had to turn your back on her screams whenever you visited Spain. When the news of her death reached you, you went into your chapel and prayed for her soul for 3 days without stopping. But you did not pray for her release from purgatory. You prayed for your own forgiveness. You realized that you had sacrificed your own mother on the altar of the state, trading her freedom for the stability of your crowns. And for what? So that you could hand those crowns to a son who looks at you with cold, calculating eyes, counting the days until you die, so he can stop paying the expenses of your retirement household. The malaria flush is intensifying now. A hot, prickling sweat breaks out across your forehead, turning the coarse linen of your nightshirt into a wet, heavy weight against your chest. Your ears begin to ring with a low, drone-like hum that sounds exactly like the watermills turning down in the valley of Vera. In this feverish half-light between waking and sleep, the line between myth and reality begins to dissolve entirely. You look toward the corner of the room where the large cedar coffin sits in the shadows. Tomorrow is the day. You have finalized all the preparations with the prior of Yuste. The invitations have been sent to the local counts and bishops. The priests have rehearsed their chants. The black velvet palls have been brushed clean of dust. You are going to stage your own funeral. You are going to dress in your winding sheet, crawl into that wooden box, and listen to the world say goodbye to you while your blood is still warm. Your advisors in Madrid wrote to you, telling you that this ceremony is a grotesque madness, an insult to the dignity of the imperial name, a symptom of the same dark melancholy that destroyed your mother. They do not understand the profound philosophical necessity of the act. You have spent your entire life being defined by your titles. You were the king, the emperor, the defender, the master. Every time you walked into a room, you were playing a role written for you by centuries of dynastic pride. You need to see what happens when the play ends. You need to hear the priests sing the requiem for Charles the man, not Charles the sovereign. You need to pull the shroud over your own face to see if the dark holds any terror left, or if it is simply the long-awaited stillness you have been chasing across Europe for 40 years. The night wind from the mountains hits the window frames with a sudden, rattling force, making the brass pendulums of Juanello's clocks swing with a frantic, irregular, jerky motion. The voices of the monks downstairs are silent now. The valley has entered that dead, frozen hour before dawn, when even the wolves stop their howling. You are alone with your echoes, Charles. The empire you fractured is already moving on without you. Your son Philip is currently building his own massive bureaucratic palace monastery at El Escorial, a cold granite mountain that will make your small cell at Yuste look like a peasant's hut. He is learning to rule with ink and ice, without ever leaving his desk, perfecting the system of absolute, distant tyranny that you initiated. You have been left behind by the very world you created. You are a living artifact, a monument of bone and gout melting away in the damp hills of Spain. But as you close your eyes against the burning heat of the fever, a strange, beautiful peace comes over your features. Let them write their myths. Let them call you a saint or a coward, an emperor or a madman. In this dark room, beneath the ticking of a dozen discordant clocks, you know the only truth that matters. The crown was a heavy crown, but the grave will be light. You surrender your body to the oncoming fever, letting the dark water of the mountain night carry away the last remnants of your imperial name, ready to wake up tomorrow to the sound of your own funeral bells. You are lying perfectly flat on your back inside the narrow cedar box, your shoulders pressed tightly against the rough, unpolished wood that smells intensely of sap, iron nails, and old earth. The linen winding sheet wrapped around your naked limbs is coarse, cold, and heavy, binding your arms against your flanks, like the swaddling clothes of an infant or the shroud of a corpse. Outside the rim of your coffin, the air is thick with the suffocating, sweet-sour perfume of burning beeswax, myrrh, and cheap tallow candles. The light filtering through your closed eyelids is not the silver starlight of the Spanish night, but a dull, flickering amber glow cast by 4 massive funeral torches standing at each corner of your bier. You can hear the heavy, measured rustle of velvet robes, the soft, hesitant clearing of throats, and the rhythmic, wet thud of teardrops hitting the stone floorboards. The local nobility of Extremadura, the monks of Yuste, and your few remaining servants are standing around you in a tight, terrified circle, their faces pale with an expression that is half horror, half religious ecstasy. They are looking down at you, the master of the Western world, the man who held their lives in his gnarled hands. Lying in the dust like a discarded coat, the prior of the monastery lifts his heavy, silver crucifix above your face. His voice rises through the vaulted arches of the chapel, a deep, resonant baritone that vibrates through the cedar walls of your box and into the bones of your spine. Requiem aeternam, Dona e Domine. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord. And from the darkness behind him, 30 monks answer in a unified, droning chant that sounds like the very earth opening its mouth to speak. Et lux perpetua luceat eis. And let perpetual light shine upon them. Think of the profound, exquisite surrender of this moment. You are listening to your own ending. For 40 years, your ears were assaulted by the loudest noises human civilization could produce. The earth-shattering roar of bronze cannons at the walls of Tunis, the frantic screaming of thousands of horses dying in the mud at Pavia, the arrogant, booming arguments of theologians at Worms, and the endless, exhausting murmur of courtiers begging for money in the galleries of Brussels. Your name was a weapon thrown across oceans, a title that made governors tremble and merchants recalculate the value of their fleets. And now it is nothing but a line in a Latin prayer sung by a collection of simple monks who will forget your face before the winter frost hits the orange trees down in the orchard. As the priests continue their slow, deliberate movement around your coffin, sprinkling holy water that hits your shroud in tiny, cold droplets, your mind begins to drift away from the theatricality of the chapel, the fever, the dark malarial fire you caught from the stagnant waters of your pleasure ponds is no longer a subtle flush. It is a raging ocean that has broken through the dams of your physical strength. It burns behind your eyes, transforming the chant of the monks into the sound of the sea, carrying you away from Yuste, away from Spain, away from the entire, exhausting architecture of your life. You find yourself returning to a memory that does not belong to the history books, a moment that happened 30 years ago in the fragrant, sun-baked gardens of the Alcazar in Seville. It was the spring of your marriage to Isabella. You were 26 years old. Your body was still straight, your joints were free from the curse of the gout, and your mind had not yet been encrusted by the ice of the German wars. You remember sitting beneath a canopy of white jasmine flowers, watching her slender fingers adjust a strange, exotic plant that had been brought to Spain from the mountains of Persia. A purple iris, its petals so dark and velvety they looked like royal robes. You had looked at her face, which was illuminated by the golden Andalusian sun, and you had felt a sudden, terrifying wave of vulnerability. You were the King of Spain, the Duke of Burgundy, the Emperor-elect, yet in her presence, those titles felt like ridiculous toys. She had looked up at you, her dark Portuguese eyes soft with the intelligence that required no words, and she had touched your protruding, awkward jaw with the tips of her fingers. Without pity, without judgment, loving the very flaw that made the rest of the world whisper. "Charles," she had whispered, her breath sweet with the scent of orange blossoms. "The world outside these walls is a monster that will try to eat your soul. It will tell you that you are a god, and it will demand that you bleed for its glory. But remember that you are only a man. When the sun goes down, the crown belongs to the dark, but your heart belongs to me." You had promised her that you would remember. You had sworn an oath on your love that you would not let the empire consume the man. But she had died, and the empire had called, and you had broken your promise. You had spent the next 20 years turning your heart into a stone, using its hardness to crush your enemies and defend your borders, until you had forgotten how to feel anything but the grinding friction of statecraft.